Hi, and welcome to today's webinars, where we will be exploring what reference states are, how they're used under the Accounting for Nature framework, and the current research project that we are working on with Accounting for Nature. So if you are unfamiliar with the webinar format, I wanted to flag that there is a Q&A button on Zoom. If you have any questions during today's session, please pop them into the Q&A chat box. And we have allocated time at the end of the presentation to answer any burning questions you might have. Before we dive into today's content, I wanted to acknowledge that this webinar is hosted on the Turrbal and Jagera People's Country, which is Manjin, also known as Brisbane in Australia. So I wanted to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and the deep connection that they have with this very diverse and beautiful place that I get to call home. As we have an international focus today, I also wanted to acknowledge the incredibly important Indigenous voices that we have around the world and the impact and influence that they must have on this very important task that we're on to try to restore and improve nature. This webinar is being recorded, so any question that you do put into the Q&A box might be mentioned during the recording. And if you're unable to join the whole session, you will be able to access the recording on our YouTube channel. My name is Amanda, and I will be the host for today's session. I have been with Accounting for Nature for the past 5 years and work largely with training and policy and environmental market development. And I will very shortly introduce our guest speaker for today. But first, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the Accounting for Nature framework. So the Accounting for Nature framework was developed on more than 15 years of research by the Wentworth Group of concerned scientists. And it was really spurred by the need of standardizing the way we measure and report on nature. So the Wentworth Group developed an approach to measure and report on environmental condition that we are now using under the Accounting for Nature framework. So we were converted into a non-for-profit by the Wentworth Group about 5 years ago now. And the whole essence of what we do is providing a standardized way to measure and communicate trends and change in environmental condition, and making sure that the way that we measure it is scientifically rigorous and that the data we're presenting has been validated so that we can really trust and underpin claims relating to the state of nature. There are a lot of different targets, goals, and frameworks and standards out there in the nature space. Accounting for Nature is really here to help support and underpin a lot of these by providing really concrete ways to go out and measure nature and report on that. So a lot of these other kind of international standards that we have out there provide quite broad guidance on what is important when it comes to nature, what we should be concerned about, but they don't necessarily provide the detailed instructions we might need on how to measure this. So that's where Accounting for Nature fits in. And if you are interested to learn more about how we can be used to support and underpin all of these different programs and targets out there, we do have a global frameworks paper available on our website when you can read more about this. So at the core of what we do is trying to bring integrity to environmental claims and markets to make sure that when we measure something, it's been scientifically best practiced way of measuring. The data is being transparently published. There's independence, which comes from third-party verification of the data that we're reporting. It's comparable, and we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the econ today. But what the whole econ allows us to do is comparing how the environment is trending across different environmental assets, across different parts of the world, and across time. We also really focus on usability, so being open to small landholders to really large corporations. And last but not least, we have an independent science committee that makes sure that there is scientific rigor behind all the measurements that are collected and reported on as a part of our framework. So at the core of what we do is that we certify environmental accounts. So we are a certification standard. And we provide all the documents and tools and resources to help support that standard and the implementation of it. We also accredit scientific measurement methods. So these are the kind of recipes for how to measure the state of nature. And we have that independent science committee that I mentioned who review all of these to make sure that they are scientifically rigorous. We also work really hard to build capacity across professionals and landholders and governments, investors, etc., on what environmental condition accounting is and how it can be used for a range of different purposes and scenarios. So since we were turned into a non-for-profit, we have registered 66 environmental accounts, and they cover about 8.5 million hectares. 25 of these have been certified, meaning that they've actually gone out, measured the state of nature, and had that data certified. We have accredited 23 different methods that allows us to measure and report on that environmental condition. And we have accredited over 100 experts and auditors, which are a network of professionals who are skilled at either implementing the framework to generate environmental accounts, or they are skilled to audit environmental accounts. So if you're a professional working in this space, please head to our website and look up accredited experts and auditors. So before we really dive into the science of today's topic, I wanted to present what environmental condition accounting is. So it's really about measuring the ecological health or condition of environmental assets. Often these days, that's also referred to as the state of nature. And the main goal of this is to track how the environmental condition is changing over time. This is slightly different to the kind of accounting that fits into the SEEA framework, so the System for Environmental Economic Accounting, where they go a step beyond condition accounting and also put a dollar value on the environment. So we do the part that kind of underpins any financial evaluation or monetary value of the environment. So our core focus is the condition measurements and making sure we get those right. So I alluded to the econ before, and it stands for the Environmental Condition Index. It is used to describe the condition of an environmental asset at a specific point in time. And it's using a scale from 0 to 100. And it's all based on something called a reference benchmark, which is the topic of today's webinar. And so what a reference benchmark does in essence is trying to describe what the state of the asset would have been in an undegraded or pristine or best possible state. And that is what we describe to as a reference benchmark of 100. Now, the econ is calculated to describe the difference between the best possible state of an environmental asset and the state that the asset is in today. And so that can range from 0 to 100 and describes basically how far away we are from a pristine state of the asset. So with that being said, I have the immense pleasure of introducing you all to Dr. Molly Grace, who is a senior research lead for Accounting for Nature, but also a research fellow at Oxford University. So she has a background in conservation biology and ecology, and we were very lucky to have her join our team last year. So with that being said, thank you, Molly, so much for joining, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm just going to sort out my screen sharing, so bear with me for just one moment. I think that is all right. Does that look okay, Amanda?
Looking good.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Amanda, to the context of our talk today. And thank you all for joining this webinar, whether it's the morning or the evening for you. But I'm here today to talk about this research partnership between Accounting for Nature and the University of Oxford. As Amanda said, I'm the senior research lead on this partnership based at Oxford. And there are a number of different research facets of this partnership. But today I'm going to focus most on one aspect, and that is developing guidance on reference states for environmental accounting in Europe. So before we get into that, let's step back a little bit. I don't think I need to tell this audience that there is global interest in measuring the state of nature. So whether that is in the context of measuring progress towards global commitments and targets, such as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework or the Sustainable Development Goals, there's also growing public awareness that humanity needs to reset our relationship with nature. So we might want to measure the state of nature to underpin claims of sustainability or nature positive action. There are also, of course, policy and regulatory drivers that would drive us to measure the state of nature. Countries are introducing or improving their nature-related legislation. So, for example, last year in the EU, the Nature Restoration Law came into effect. And in 2021, the Environment Act in the UK came into play. And then, of course, there's the whole space of nature credits and biodiversity credits. But regardless of where you're coming from, all of these require the robust measurement, reporting, and verification of the state of nature over time. The challenge there is how do you verify these nature-related claims, claims about improvements in the state of nature in a cost-effective way? And there is a lack of quality data, a lack of governance, and a lack of unified standards that make it difficult for market participants to verify the integrity of these claims. And as Amanda really nicely summarized just now, Accounting for Nature is one of the groups rising to meet this challenge. But there are definitely certain research questions that remain. And this brings me to the Accounting for Nature Oxford Partnership, which was established in late 2024. So we're kind of still early on in this partnership. But the idea is that the University of Oxford would partner with Accounting for Nature to provide world-leading research on how to adapt the Accounting for Nature framework for use outside of Australia. And so in today's webinar, I'm going to give a very quick overview, a little bit more detail than Amanda just gave about what is the Accounting for Nature framework and how does it operate. Then I'm going to give context for one of the research foci of our partnership, which is adapting the framework for use in the UK and the EU, in particular determining reference states for Europe. And then if we have time, I'm just going to touch very, very briefly on another element of our partnership, another active area of research, which is how do you provide guidance on attributing positive impact? So attributing nature positive claims. And then we'll have some time for questions for you all, from you all. So to start, I will give a very brief overview of how the Accounting for Nature framework operates. And I do have to put in the disclaimer that I'm very much a newcomer in the Accounting for Nature space. And as Amanda mentioned, this framework has been developed over more than 15 years with the contribution of a lot of people, not least the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, many of whom are on the Accounting for Nature board, and of course the AFN Independent Science Committee. So just to acknowledge the work of all of those people and that, I am not responsible for the framework that I'm about to describe. So the Accounting for Nature framework can be implemented for various purposes, but there are two big ones that I'm going to focus on today. So the first is the framework can be used to describe the condition of an environmental asset and its change in condition through time. It can also be used to understand the cause of the change in condition of an environmental asset. So whether that change is due to management actions or was it just due to natural variability or disturbance. And these two purposes are central to the partnership I'll be discussing today. So when I'm describing the framework, I'm going to focus primarily on that first purpose. So how does the framework describe the condition of an environmental asset? The first thing to consider is that the framework is explicitly a spatial framework. So under the framework, the condition of an environmental asset is described within what's called an account area. So you can see a number of different examples of account areas to which you could apply the framework on the screen. And these areas are not linked to a particular scale. So you could have relatively small scales for your account area, such as a project or a property. An account area could represent an entire region, or you could have an aggregate account area where the areas being considered are spatially distributed. So regardless of the scale of your account area, this implies that there is an important spatial and mapping element to consider when applying the framework, and this is going to be really important for the research I'm going to describe today. Before moving forward, you might be wondering what we mean by an environmental asset. So we're using the framework to measure changes in condition of an asset over time. So environmental assets are just the component of nature under consideration. You can see different environmental asset classes on the screen. So we could have the asset class of fauna. So we could be looking at change in condition of a particular species within our account area or a group of species like songbirds, for example. Other asset classes include vegetation, soil and sediment, microorganisms, entire ecosystems, or water. And the framework allows the condition of any of these assets to be measured. Sorry, my screen just went a little bit funny, but I think we're back on track. So the second thing to consider in the framework is how that condition of that asset is actually measured. So you've seen this slide before, but it's a really key concept to understanding the framework, so I'm showing it again. So at the heart of the Accounting for Nature framework is the econt, which, as Meta said, is a standardized metric that describes the condition of an asset on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 represents the fully degraded state of the asset and 100 represents the intact or undegraded reference state. And you'll notice that everything about the econt is defined relative to this reference state or reference benchmark, which you can see at the top of the figure, representing 100. And I'll talk about how that reference benchmark is determined later, because it's a key element of the research we're conducting. But for now, let's focus on calculating an econt when we know the reference state. So to calculate an econt for an environmental asset, you need two elements of the reference state. You need the reference extent. So what is the reference distribution of the environmental asset? And what is the reference condition? So what benchmarks will you use to measure the asset's condition relative to reference levels? You might be wondering, how on earth could we know the reference extent and condition? And that is where the methods come in. So Accounting for Nature has accredited methods that provide specific instructions on how to measure and calculate an econt, depending on the asset you're looking at, the level of accuracy you need, and at what scale you're looking at. So let's assume that these reference extent and condition are provided for you in one of these methods. So if we look at the vegetation asset class, there are currently 15 accredited methods in the Accounting for Nature space. So if we zoom in on this method 6 for native vegetation, this is a method developed for use in Australia. And what the method does is it provides a map of reference vegetation types. These are vegetation types found prior to colonial land clearing. You can map this reference extent to your account area, and the method also provides indicators of reference vegetation condition that within your account area you can take samples of and measure to assess the condition. So if we look at our account area in this example, so we have our top image. This rectangular area is our account area. This example is coming from Queensland, Australia. So in this example, using the method, we have a reference extent given by a model of pre-clearing regional ecosystems developed by the government of Queensland. So we can see in the top, it's showing our reference extent. We have two native vegetation types in our account area. The light blue is a Eucalyptus crabber woodland on sand plains. The brown is Eucalyptus poplanea woodland on alluvial plains. So it's quite high resolution data here. And this is the undegraded extent of vegetation in our account area. Then we can also look at current land use. So we see in this image on the bottom that within our account area, currently the land is being used for different things. We have areas of woodland restoration, poultry farming, protected woodland, and grazing. And then we can overlay these two things together to see in our reference areas what the land is currently being used by. And we can use this stratified information to calculate our econd. So within each of those reference vegetation types, the method specifies indicators of reference condition, so the undegraded condition. And you can see on the screen that for native vegetation, these indicators are things like vegetation configuration and composition, so things like grass cover, canopy height, etc. And so within each of our stratified areas, we can collect data on these indicators to compare to the reference condition. And as I said, the method will outline which indicators need to be measured at each sample site. And finally, how does this all come together? Well, the indicators in each stratified area are given an indicator condition score from 0 to 100, and these are aggregated across the account area to calculate an econd. So obviously, there is a specific way to do this aggregation, but it's too much to describe in this webinar. But one way that you can think of it is that when more parts of the account area more closely resemble their reference condition, the higher their indicator condition scores and the higher the econd for the account area. So that is how the framework is measuring environmental condition. So that was my very quick basic overview of the Accounting for Nature framework. And as I mentioned, this framework has primarily been used in Australia to date, which brings us to the question of this Oxford AFN research partnership. How do we adapt this approach for use elsewhere, and why might we need to? So again, we've seen this figure before, but the econd is the heart of the framework. And it hinges on this idea of a reference benchmark or reference state. But we haven't yet discussed how reference states are set, and this is crucial to expansion of the framework globally. So a reference benchmark or reference state is a scientific estimate of the condition of an asset in its undegraded or intact state. And importantly, as we're talking about expanding this globally, reference state can be defined with regard to land use change, cultural and societal considerations. So reference state doesn't necessarily mean non-human state, but it does probably represent a better, quote unquote, state of the asset than we're observing today. And one of the reasons this research partnership was established with Oxford specifically is that Oxford has been a real pioneer in research on reference states. One of the big pieces of work relating to reference states coming out of Oxford, among other collaborators, is something called the IUCN Green Status of Species, which was released in 2021 as a global standard for measuring species recovery. And I am actually the co-chair of the scientific working group that's been developing this global standard. So the green status of species measures species status relative to a pre-impact reference state, conceptually very similar to what we're talking about with the Accounting for Nature framework. And actually, if we look at the figure, we see some similarities between the green status and the econd. Within the green status of species, we assess a species recovery score that, like the econd, is measured from 0 to 100, where 100% represents a fully recovered or non-depleted species, and 0% represents a species that is far from recovery, so it is extinct or extinct in the wild. And this was designed to be applicable to all animals, plants, and fungi globally, which means that we had to consider what different reference benchmarks would be all around the world. And this global view is really important because depending on where you are in the world, you might want to set the reference date very differently. So thinking about the Australian context, as I mentioned, in many methods developed for use in Australia, the benchmark for the reference date, so where the econ equals 100, is the extent and condition of the asset prior to European colonization. And Australia has really great data on pre-colonization reference extent and condition for many environmental assets. So this works really well. Considering our earlier example of native vegetation, we have a relatively small account area pictured there, only a few kilometers squared, but we have high resolution mapping of pre-colonial native vegetation. And this is made possible by detailed maps of modeled reference vegetation. In the case of this example, it's the pre-clearing regional ecosystems model developed for Queensland. And this high resolution spatial mapping of reference extent is what allows us to apply the AFN framework. However, when we look to Europe, it's harder to find analogous detailed maps and models of reference extent for environmental assets. It's not as readily available. And so why is that? So for one thing, Europe has a longer history of relatively high human population compared to colonized regions. So when we look at this figure, we see population in millions on the y-axis, year on the x-axis, starting at the beginning of the Common Era. And we see the population of the area now known as Australia in light blue, turquoise, and the area of the population of the area now known as the USA in purple. So of course, both of these areas were colonized by Europeans. And until that point of colonization, these areas had populations of less than 1 million people. And there was a sharp exponential growth in population after colonization. So it might make sense it might make sense to consider the condition and extent of assets before colonization to represent an intact or undegraded state. But when we look at some representative countries in Europe, so we have France in orange, the UK in dark blue, and Spain in green, there's over time a much higher human population, and there's not as clear of a signature, at least in recent history, of major changes in population size. If we look at this from a different angle, this figure is showing cropland in Europe in 1750. So we have, even at that time, signatures of highly modified land use going far back in time. So the question is this a useful reference benchmark? Does it represent the undegraded or intact state? And this brings me to the research that we are just beginning to embark on, which is working to determine reference states for Europe. So to start, we are going to be focusing on the vegetation environmental asset class. You have to start somewhere. We can't kind of develop methods for everything all at once. But we are going to be proposing an approach to measure native vegetation extent and condition in Europe. We will be collaborating with partners in the UK and the EU to apply this approach at their sites. And we're going to be getting feedback from that, getting learnings from that, to use as part of a longer term aim to develop a reference state protocol that will provide rules for determining reference state for any environmental asset anywhere in the world. So we're starting with Europe and native vegetation, but we hope to develop broader guidance based on the learnings from this work. So I said we would provide an approach for measuring reference state. This is work that is currently in development, but part of that is thinking about how do you measure the reference extent? So if reference state represents the intact, undegraded condition of the environmental asset, how can that be mapped in Europe? So, didn't realize there was sound for this, but I've shown you some maps already, but this is another way of putting this issue, this need for dedicated research in perspective. So the animation which is going on was created by worldpopulationhistory.org. The animation started at 1000 CE and continues to the present. I'll start it again just so we can see. Hopefully this will work. No, it won't. There we go. But each dot represents 1 million people. And we can see that even 1,000 years ago, there were millions of people in Europe. By the time Australia gets even its first million, Europe is just a mass of population dots. So just again, putting that long history of human modification of the landscape in Europe into perspective. So given such a long history of high human population, there isn't a clear reference point in time where vegetation was undegraded, quote unquote. And in addition, when we're thinking about reference states, we shouldn't disregard the long history of cultural use and human relationships with nature in Europe. So potentially, what are our options for doing this? So one option is the idea of potential natural vegetation. So this represents the vegetation communities modeled to occur in an area in the absence of human influence. So basically, it's a suitability distribution model based on factors like soil, slope, hydrology, geology, and climate that are matched to reference samples of vegetation that we have. And actually, something like this already does exist for Europe. We have the map of natural vegetation of Europe, which was developed a few decades ago as part of a pan-European collaboration to map potential natural vegetation. So you might think, oh, we have this map, fantastic, we have our spatial data, let's go. However, there are issues with the scale of this map. So we've just taken this Europe-wide map, we've zoomed into an area in Scotland, and the area outlined in red shows the boundaries of Cairngorms National Park in Scotland. This area is over 4,500 kilometers squared. So we're not seeing high resolution mapping vegetation communities in this example. If we compare to that Australian example I showed earlier as I was walking through the framework, that account area was less than 10 kilometers squared. So while potential natural vegetation has promise, this existing map probably won't suit our accounting purposes, especially not at small scales. However, this doesn't mean that we should completely abandon the idea of potential natural vegetation when thinking about reference extent in Europe. There have been a number of projects across Europe that build on the Europe-wide map of potential natural vegetation and refine it to higher resolution within particular countries. So for example, Blasi et al. Used the Europe-wide map, which we can see on the left, so just zoomed into Italy. And they used it as a base to further subdivide into units that would be useful for planning in Italy, which you can see on the right. And if you compare these two images, we see much higher resolution data in the Italy-specific map. So one option that we have is to use these improved maps region by region. So if you're doing an environmental account in Italy, you use the Italian potential natural vegetation map. However, unfortunately, these improved maps are not available in all regions. Another option is to generate finer resolution maps of potential natural vegetation based on existing mapping of relevant associated variables like bedrock, soils, and hydrology. And these data are available across most of Europe. I've shown some examples from the UK on the screen. So bedrock map from the British Geological Survey and hydrology of soil types from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And in fact, this work is already underway by others. So as part of the European environmental accounting efforts, there's work coming out of Wageningen University in the Netherlands, led by Sander Muker and Stefan Hennekens, to map habitat suitability of specific habitat types. So there is a European-wide UNIS habitat classification that is used in environmental accounting. And they are mapping habitat suitability based on variables including climate, soil, topography, elevation, and hydrology. You can see in the image an example of the process used to map this suitability. It's for a specific UNIS habitat type, so wet heath habitat type. And to think about the resolution of these data, this is one of 46 types of heath classification under this UNIS framework. So the resolution is quite high. So samples were taken from the European Vegetation Archive and associated with background variables, and this was used to project which areas would be suitable for this habitat type. So this is a work in progress, but it could definitely help us understand potential natural vegetation in Europe. And finally, to bring another element into the mix, we expect that understanding potential natural vegetation won't necessarily be enough when it comes to defining reference states, especially in an area with such long history of high human population pressure. So we expect in our pilots to also introduce elements of human relationships with the land. For example, one spatial resource that exists throughout the UK and the Republic of Ireland is the mapping of landscape character areas. So landscape character areas identify and explain the combination of elements and features that make landscapes distinct from one another and show how the landscape is perceived and experienced by people. So landscape character areas are classified by landform, land cover, but also by settlement and human history. So this sort of human interaction with nature, human relationship with nature is also something we'll be considering as we're trying to figure out reference extent. Now, for defining a reference state, you need not just reference extent, but also reference condition. And luckily, this is something that there may already be fit for purpose tools to use. So there have been condition indicators developed extensively for use in the CA accounting framework in natural capital accounting. As an example, we see this Science for Policy report of an EU-wide methodology to map and assess ecosystem condition. So we're hoping that we don't need to reinvent the wheel here, but definitely as we go through our piloting, this will help determine if any adjustments are needed, especially when we're looking at smaller spatial scales, for example, projects or uh, entire sites. And finally, I'm going to leave us some time for questions, but I wanted to really quickly highlight one other completely different research element of this partnership between Oxford and AFN, which is developing guidance on attributing positive impact. So we've seen this slide before. Primarily in this talk, I've been focusing on the first purpose described for the Accounting for Nature framework, so measuring condition, describing condition. But the framework can also be used to understand the cause of changes in condition. And so our research partnership also covers this area. There's a very strong tradition of research at the University of Oxford in counterfactuals, in impact evaluation. And so as part of this, we are working on guidelines for attribution. So we don't really have time to talk too much about this today, but please do get in touch if you're interested in this element of the work as well. So to recap, in today's webinar, we've covered a number of things. We've got a very high-level overview of the Accounting for Nature framework and how it operates. We've talked about the need to adapt the framework for use in the UK and the EU. I've described our initial thoughts and how we might go about determining reference states in the UK and the EU, and how we might use pilots to assess whether that method works. And I've touched on the other element of our research partnership, which is developing guidance on attributing positive impact. So with that, I think, oh, not yet. I will say, just put in a quick plug, that if you are interested in this research, please do get in touch. We have our email address there on the screen, and anything related to this webinar will be passed on to me. So whether you are interested in getting involved in pilot testing as a partner, you have suggestions about data sources or strategies, we're very keen to get others' inputs, scientific inputs, and practitioner inputs. Or if you simply want to learn more about the project, please do get in touch at info@accountingfornature.org. And with that, I think I will pass back to Amanda for a bit of Q&A.
Thank you so much, Molly. There's no questions in the Q&A chat box yet, but we will leave it open for a minute in case anyone has a question. And for anyone who's like me and might need to sleep and digest the information you received from Molly today, please don't hesitate to contact us at the info@accountingfornature email address. We are more than happy to answer any of the questions that come through to us. And for those who did join the session a bit late and who might have missed the intro, I wanted to also mention that this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So you will get an email once that recording becomes available, so you can go in and rewatch any part that you might have missed. So whilst we are waiting for potential Q&A questions, I wanted to ask Molly, is there a specific country that this research is starting to focus on, or is it taking a very kind of broad European lens?
Yeah, really good question. So being based at the University of Oxford, there is definitely a bit of a UK focus, at least initially. So we do have a number of pilot partners already signed on to the project based in England and Scotland at the moment. But the key is to develop guidance for Europe more broadly. And so we are really keen to engage with partners and stakeholders in the EU and bring them on into our pilots.
Fabulous.
Oh, thank you, Brett.
If there
And I
are,
will say,
oh, go for it, Molly.
I was just going to put in a plug just to say that, again, we are at a very early stage in this research partnership. So we have lots of ideas, but they all need to be tested. And so Very keen to engage with people on this webinar, with your colleagues, with other stakeholders that you work with, to think creatively about how we might be able to determine reference states for Europe.
Great. Thank you. It doesn't seem like your presentation has caused any confusion, Molly, since there's no questions coming through in the Q&A. I'm sure that means everything has been very clearly articulated today.
There's much, yeah.
So again, if you do have questions later, please don't hesitate to email us at info@accountingfornature.org. But otherwise, I wish everyone who's joined us from Australia a good evening and a good night. And for anyone who's joined us from Europe, I wish you have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.